the grey areas can be complicated, but trust me on this. I'm telling you the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, because that's what we do here at Talk Radio. Now, let's have a word with Helen Dale. Helen, a very good morning to you.
Good morning, Mike. How are you?
I'm very well. I do like a good political spat amongst people.
Oh, it's a wonderful stooshy, as the Scots say.
It
even
is.
a bit of a stramash. Actually,
It is a stramash.
More than a stooshy. It's a stramash.
Although, of course, the trouble is that without wishing to denigrate all of the particular players in the game, there's not really any of them who I would like to back on the grounds of decency. And sort of the trustworthiness, because they're all pretty much a sort of a nest of vipers, aren't they?
Well, we've got this broader problem of, and this is particularly salient with Cummings and the whole Barnard Castle story, which is now every time that comes up, it's a cue for people to make jokes about testing your eyesight.
Yes.
By getting behind the wheel of a car, which is obviously not a very smart move. But it's not just the Dominic Cummings. He's just a really good flagship example. But remember Professor Pantsdown, the bonking boffin?
Well, not only do I remember him, but unfortunately Radio 4 Today programme still seems to think he's worth talking to. They get him on about once a week.
Well, this is the problem you've got now is you've got Neil Ferguson, the bonking boffin, being taken seriously despite being utterly incapable of following his own rules.
Yeah.
You've now got Dominic Cummings being taken seriously despite also being utterly incapable of following his own rules, and various other journalists, but involved in all of this nonsense earlier that we've talked about previously on the Independent Republic. You've got this problem of people having views, or in the case of Cummings and Ferguson, actually being the author of at least guidance and probably some of the legislation, which of course has not had adequate parliamentary scrutiny, as people like Francis Hare and Adam Wagner have been pointing out, and Silky Carlo at Big Brother Watch now as well have been pointing out for some time, inadequate parliamentary scrutiny, which is how it finishes up being full of nonsense and not working properly. Now, the issue for me here, and it's not just me, because these things do get cut through in a way that perhaps Dominic Cummings calling Matt Hancock, who I must admit people in my area, to give you an idea of how disliked he became over the care homes fiasco and then over the contradictory rules with respect to lockdown. People were making Halloween fright masks out of Matt Hancock's face.
He's a very unlikable man. I mean, he doesn't come across well. He does not come across well. He comes across as a smug kind of, leave me alone, I know what I'm doing type of guy. Doesn't seem to be interested in anybody else's view, doesn't seem to be interested in anybody else's questions. He's just I don't think a terribly effective individual. But what I am told is that inside of Downing Street, they literally think the sun shines out of his backside.
Well, this is a classic example of the politician who is very likeable to his friends, but comes across horribly in public. And this is not just a problem of Matt Hancock's, because I'm in the legal profession, I know people, and I went to the same university as him as well, albeit in a different year. I know people who know Keir Starmer really well. Yeah. People who've worked with him and who say he, in person with the camera not on him, he's funny, he's charming, he's clearly very good at his job and very disciplined, particularly in this case, they're talking about him as a lawyer and head of the CPS. And they can't, and one friend...
Well, he wasn't that good when he was head of the CPS, because I can give you a chapter and verse on what he didn't do, what he should have done.
Jimmy Savile and grooming gangs, right. Yes. But they say, in person, they know what they saw when they went to university with him or practiced with him or were opposed to him when they were acting as defence counsel, and they actually can't recognise the person they see on television. Now, it would not surprise, or hear on the radio, it would not surprise me if this is the same with Matt Hancock, and it also wouldn't surprise me if it were not the case with Dominic Cummings as well, who comes across particularly badly on television. And it's really, in a way, it's unfortunate that this is something I think that is become a modern difficulty for men. A lot of men are quite wooden when they present on television. And you must have had the experience as a radio announcer of trying to get people to show themselves a bit more, to be a bit livelier, or otherwise people switch off talk radio and don't want to listen to you because the person being interviewed is boring. Yeah. Now, women I get away with wiggling my fingers a lot more than someone like Peter Hitchens or Neil Oliver does. If they do it, they look silly. Whereas women are given more of a pass to show a bit of verve, I suppose, or to in their voices or in our voices or when we speak. So you get these blokes who just come across as that. Well, I get that feeling that someone's put a key in the middle of their back and wound it up, and now it's unwinding, or someone's pulling their string and the mouth is going, and you're just sitting there going,
but they also need to,
you're not a human, you're like a robot.
Yeah, but we're not talking about people who are not in the public eye here. I mean, I would say quite often the people who are less able to communicate in person in a live interview are those who are not used to doing it. But those who are used to doing it, I mean, Keir Starmer, being a lawyer, should be used to public speaking. He should be used to standing up in a court of law and making a case. He should also be used to it, having been an MP for many, many years, standing up in the House of Commons and making a speech. But, you know, even despite all of that, he still can't do it. He isn't any good. Dominic Cummings, the same. I mean, he will have been, like anyone from the thick of it, a guy who has made plenty of public statements, plenty of public speeches when he was in Downing Street, you know, plenty of group meetings that he would have held. And in fact, when he was in the garden talking about Barnard Castle this time last year, he was pretty lucid. And I don't think he wasn't lucid yesterday. I just think he came across as a very weird guy. You know, 7 and a bit hours of talking about one thing effectively and trying to make sure that people he wanted to kill were being damaged. You know, he just came across to me as a very bitter and twisted individual.
Well, this is part of the problem of he wanted to recruit weirdos and misfits to number 10.
Yeah.
Because he got this idea in his head that you can actually make technocratic governance work. That it is possible for government to know enough about the individual choices and preferences of citizens in order to engage in technocratic governance, which is why he's constantly singing the praises of countries like Taiwan or Japan, and occasionally, although he tends to stay away because they've done it differently, Australia and New Zealand with handling the pandemic. Now, I personally disagree with him on that because I actually do think culture matters, and I think cultures are different. And I think it was legitimate and fair for Boris Johnson, if what Cummings says is true, and leaving Hancock and being a Halloween fright mask to one side, it is legitimate and fair to say we really shouldn't be doing something that was first done in the People's Republic of China in a Western liberal democracy. And those countries that either didn't do it at all, which is basically all of Australia except Victoria, all of New Zealand, Japan, which declares a state of emergency but then can't enforce it. We should be looking to those societies rather than countries that followed the People's Republic of China over a cliff in terms of the treatment of its population with respect to lockdowns. Yeah. Now, I think that we've established that Britain is a high trust society, that even though there were quite a lot of I called it shy COVIDiots, you know, people who weren't following the rules. The majority of the population clearly were. So the behavioural scientists who allegedly said that no, our population in a Western liberal democracy will not engage in this behaviour, they were clearly wrong. And other scholars, people like Stuart Ritchie, for example, the chap who wrote Science Fictions, have pointed out there are real problems with behavioural psychology and behavioural economics because the papers don't replicate. We've got this problem of they do a study, the famous one that everybody jokes about is, remember when people at Tory conference were all standing with their legs apart?
Yes, when they were doing the power posing thing, yeah. That was,
and it's nonsense, it
That was
doesn't
in
replicate.
the bad old days of Theresa May and George Osborne, wasn't it?
Yes, but also, I mean, and poor Sajid Javid, he's really short. He comes up to about my chin. He was trying to do it, and it just made him look ridiculous. Yeah. You know, a jockey does a power pose. It's not going to work with someone who's that little. But people got bought into these silly psychological ideas that turn out not to be true. But by the same token, you can ignore all the arguments of the behavioural psychologists if they were made. And of course, people are now disputing that. And just say, perhaps it's unwise in a Western liberal democracy to copy what China did. Because China is an authoritarian regime.
Yeah, but what's interesting about what we learned, one of the things we did learn yesterday, was that actually SAGE were not recommending lockdown back in February, even though Boris Johnson eventually ended up making it a lockdown in March. And as far as people doing mostly what they were asked to do, there wasn't much else you could do because everything was shut. I mean, you could only go. I mean, my sole kind of adventure was a Saturday morning trip to Waitrose. That was all I did.
Yes, and we've also now seen with the lockdowns that you can make them mostly work in Britain. They've clearly been able to in Victoria and Australia, where they're going into their fourth lockdown now. It is possible to get people to do them in a Western liberal democracy, and it's possible to make them work. But just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. Now, it's very clear that Australia and New Zealand largely dealt with their problem through quarantine. Now, quarantine is ancient. It goes back to classical antiquity. It goes back to the Justinianic plague in the 6th century AD. So it is possible to make quarantine work. But once again, people are aware, even Cummings, who's into this forecasting thing, which I don't think it is possible to do, and they're all going to come a dreadful cropper, and they have a lot of them already. You've already got this thing that you can stop things at the border, but at the same time, the retrospectoscope going back to February and March last year is the World Health Organization was recommending against quarantine along the Australian model, and was busily having a go at Donald Trump for shutting the border to what we would call now red list countries. Yet Australia and New Zealand, because both those countries have largely abrogated the international law in this area, and good luck to them. I mean, a lot of international law it's not even really law.
But also it's easier for them. Nonsense. It's easier for them to do it, Helen, isn't it? Because they are at the end of everybody's destination list as opposed to in the middle of it. And
we were told Australia not so much because of the close association historically with China over many decades.
Yeah, but you don't get. But what I'm saying is you don't go to Australia really en route to anywhere else. You go to Australia if you're going to Australia, whereas people
that is true.
People supposedly come through London all the time because they're going somewhere else, and that was why we were told supposedly that we couldn't shut the borders. We now know that partly there was a problem with people worrying that it might be seen as racist if we did that, which is ludicrous. But also, secondly, Australia is
always accused of racism over its immigration policy, and yet it's the most ethnically diverse country on the planet. I mean, this is nonsense, and people who say things like that need to be given a swift boot up the bottom, because it is just nonsense. It's the standard sort of lefty rhetoric that you get, that anybody who wants to control the borders in some way is a racist. It has to stop. This just has to.
Well, I mean, suddenly there was no argument when we eventually closed the border to India, except the problem is we haven't actually closed the border to India because there are still people coming in and out of India. There are still flights coming here from India. And so the government's kind of consistent failure has been a totally leaky border, because they've said that certain travel is restricted, but it's only been restricted for some people. You know, like I've been hearing for the best part of the last 2 months now, oh, well, lots of people go backwards and forwards to India because they have family there and they have business there. Well, I have family in America, but I'm not going there because I'm not supposed to, so therefore I haven't done it. You know, it seems to be one rule.
It seems to be one rule. Going on with all of this, yes.
Well, it does, doesn't it?
But you've got this overall problem where lots of stuff was done by seat of the pants. Lots of it was wrong. Probably the most egregious thing that happened is the thing that we all already know about and wasn't a revelation from Cummings, which is the discharging of people from hospital into care homes without them being tested for COVID. I mean, that has clearly and obviously led to deaths. We can all see that. But we've all known that. There's no revelation in what Cummings has said to the committee in the Commons, for the simple reason that we've all known that this was the great disaster of Britain's response.
Well, those of us who have been critical, Helen, of government policy, which includes me and certainly Julie Hartley-Brewer and many others at TalkRADIO, you know, most of what Cummings said yesterday was what we had been saying for a very long time anyway. You know, that it was very clear that they were making mistakes in care homes. It was very obvious that people were dying in hospitals. It was very clear that they should have shut down the borders. All of those things we said. We said them all. We said them a year ago. What I don't understand is why Cummings didn't say them a year ago, because nothing's changed apart from his attitude to the people inside Downing Street.
Well, how long is a piece of string? God knows what's going on in number 10 Downing Street at the moment. And you hear all these sort of ridiculous stuff about it, and it periodically leaks. So it's about the dog, or it's about wallpaper, or that kind of thing,
yes.
as if any of this is relevant. And what it is, what produces this ridiculous relationship with the press and with all the fervid nonsense in the Westminster Village about Dominic Cummings now, is people want to get cut through with one of these things, and it almost never happens. You almost never.
Well, the Daily Mail
through.
today, I was saying, has got 13 to 15 pages on this. I mean, talk about overkill. But that's been the paper that Dominic Cummings has been leaking to all along.
But people want cut through with one of these Westminster Village stories, and it does occasionally happen. Poor Ed Miliband and the sandwich.
Yeah.
The entire country finished up knowing about that, and it's trivial. It's the kind of thing that gets cut through in the Westminster Village, but you don't expect it to travel. But
well, actually, no, but it does, funnily enough, because it's actually, that's the kind of stuff that the Westminster Village doesn't get, funnily enough. They don't understand why people remember Ed Miliband for eating a bacon sandwich. They think he should be remembered for something else. That's all he's remembered for, honestly.
It's a bacon and a weird face. His face is sort of lopsided. Yeah, I mean, can't do that. I can't do that thing with my face.
It's unfortunate for him, because I'm sure that there were other pictures where he looked completely normal. But, you know, I've worked in newspaper offices, and the pictures come in and you look at them and you go, that's the picture. That's the one. Let's put it in the paper right now. And I mean, unfortunately, it's the same as John Prescott. John Prescott remembered really largely for his wife wanting to get a car ride 250 yards down the Blackpool seafront because she didn't want her hair to get messed up at Labour Party conference, and for punching the guy that threw an egg at him. Brilliant. You know, never mind any of the policies he ever stood for, or any
of the other things he might have achieved in his life. He's remembered for being fist happy.
Yeah,
and I have to say that I remember when that happened, and I had friends of mine going, you know, I think he might have boxed a bit.
Yeah, you know, it's true.
Stop someone.
No, but I mean, actually, he was seen as a bit of a grumpy, slightly arrogant former kind of trade unionist. After that, people loved him. People were like, this is great. He's actually done something that most politicians wouldn't do. Because if somebody threw an egg at me, I'd punch him, you know.
Well, this is the other thing. And we're getting back to the problem of low trust in political leadership, and a related problem. And I've had a smaller version of this happen to me myself, where the staffer, to use the Australian expression, staffers, senior advisors and chiefs of staff, as they're called in Australia, are become a bigger story, and they're not elected. Now, this happened to me to a degree because I was a senior advisor to an Australian senator, and when he hired me, it became a news story because he'd hired a person who'd won the Miles Franklin Award. And yes, there were lots of smart remarks along the lines of, oh, Senator Lionhelm, he wants really fancy speeches, because it's happened once before. Paul Keating hired an award-winning writer called Don Watson to be his speechwriter. And you had this situation, and it was very awkward for both Don Watson, and then it was awkward for me in 2014, because the SPAD, as you say over here, or the staffer, became the story instead of the politician. And that is really, really annoying. And you don't want it to, you don't want it to happen. No, to use the Australianism. Yes, I'm a good writer. Yes, I'll be writing speeches for my politician, but they are still his ideas. He is the politician. He was elected. And that's the other problem we've got with technocracy here, and is my main criticism of someone like Dominic Cummings. Realistically, there's no government big enough for this man. He's utterly convinced that you can find smart technocrats that are a bit like him, a bit weird, and they can run everything properly and do everything properly and forecast what people in a liberal democracy will be able to do in advance. Now, I'm reasonably confident that that is not possible. It may be possible in China with their social credit system, but once again, we're getting back to this situation of, to what degree do you want to copy a totalitarian regime that is reasonably suspected by people who know a lot about what happens in the region of perpetrating a genocide against a religious minority?
Yeah. Well, you basically don't want to be anywhere near that.
You just don't want to go anywhere near that.
No,
I'm sorry.
You absolutely don't. Helen, listen, we've got to run because we're already out of time, but thank you for that. Very interesting summation of what happened yesterday and why we are where we are. Absolutely no chance, in my view,